Okay, my name is Bill Vetterling. I'm from a company called Zinc Imaging, formerly called Polaroid, and we're located in Bedford, Massachusetts. We have this manufacturing plant that's down in North Carolina. We're making an imaging media, that's our history, but it's not photographic. It's a thermal media. It makes prints that looks like photographs, but actually they're not sensitive to light. So you can manufacture this material in a well-lit factory, and you can handle it out in the light without any special care. And we've been making a bunch of portable products with it. For example, in the middle here, this Polaroid Pogo camera, which is an instant camera that produces prints, but it does it thermally, not photographically. And now on to the Library of Babel. In 1941, an Argentinian author named Jorge Luis Borges published a work entitled The Library of Babel in a collection of his short stories called The Garden of Forking Paths. And this work describes a hypothetical ancient library that was made up of a 3D array, and a very large 3D array, of hexagonal rooms. And as he describes it, each room has a door coming in and out. So you can pass from room to room, and there are 4 walls covered with books. There are 5 shelves for each of the hexagon's walls. Each shelf contains 35 books of uniform format. Each book is 410 pages. Each page is 40 lines. Each line is 80 characters, all of which are black in color. And this information is all totally irrelevant, but very detailed in case if you want to do calculations after you've heard this talk, then this is what you use to do them. But if you do that, then you've probably missed the point. This library is vast, and explorers had mounted expeditions into the far reaches of the library to see what it contained. And they had come back and reported that, as far as they could tell, there were no 2 books alike in the entire library. How they would know that, I have no idea. But in fact, scholars had developed the belief that the library actually contains every possible book. Namely, you take our alphabet and all the punctuation that we use, and you construct the letters in every possible combination and order, and produce every possible book. And it's not an infinite collection, because I've just described to you what the format of the books is. And if I told you how many letters were in the alphabet, you'd be able to calculate how many books were in the library. So it's not infinite, but it's a very big library. Most of the books in the library are pure gibberish, but it's believed that the library also contains every coherent book that had ever been written, and more interestingly, every book that ever would be written. So you can imagine what is in this library. For example, you'll find books like Macbeth, written by Svante Lickmark, the CEO of COMSOL. And, you know, I thought that was a British play, but it turns out Swedish. There's also a book called Apology to Svante for Plagiarizing His Work, written by William Shakespeare. There's Macbeth written backwards by the backwards Svante Lickmark. And there's the book Nabid Kafui by Tubaf Majub Basi. Basel. Sounds like a Kenyan runner. But actually, it's, again, Macbeth by Svante Lickmark, but with all the letters transposed by 1 in the alphabet. That is, every book that you can ever imagine appears in this library, including every possible coded version of that book, every possible translation into any language. They're all in the library. And this is several thousand years before Shakespeare ever lived. Also, you'll find things like Macbeth translated into C++, which for your entertainment I have done here in 4 lines of code, translated the entirety of Macbeth. The Macbeth starts with 2 declarations, double toil and double trouble, which you read as double, double toil and trouble. It goes on to Macbeth's famous soliloquy, my hand equals his dagger, ick me, which is read as, is this a dagger I see before me, handle towards my hand? And then the prediction of the witches, dead Macbeth equals new Dunsinane of Birnam Wood, which is Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come. So if you send Birnam Wood to Dunsinane, it generates a new object called dead Macbeth. Now, the speaker in the story says that some of the books that have been found are regarded as national treasures. For example, I quote from him, one of which my father saw in a hexagon on circuit 1594 was made up of the letters MCV, perversely repeated from the first line to the last. Another, very much consulted in this area, is a mere labyrinth of letters, but the next to the last page says, O time thy pyramids. And when you read O time thy pyramids, you say, this is poetry. Some intelligent being wrote this book. But what did he mean by the previous 408 pages of gibberish? And then you slap yourself across the face and say, well, what did he mean by O time thy pyramids? For every book in the library, there are millions identical to it, except each having one spelling error. And there are almost 1 trillion copies of the same book having 2 spelling errors. Your very next research paper is already in the library, 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and it has my name on it as author. Unfortunately, that was a long time ago, and I don't remember the details. Otherwise, I'd be happy to help you out with your paper. There are also quite a few books that contain well-known texts with errors. For example, a copy of the 10 Commandments that says, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal. And instead of thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, it says your neighbor's wife is a babe, give her a call. Now, that's all lighthearted, but the idea is that in this library you see these shadowy figures moving around, just pulling books off the shelves and looking in them and then putting them back on the shelves. And these are, let's call them monks, a shadowy group of monks that are searching this library because they know somewhere in this library is a book that correctly explains the meaning of life. It also, there are books that discuss the cures for all the great epidemic diseases and the sources of food for hungry populations, instructions for controlling the weather and protecting crops, the entire history of the world, past and future, and how it will end, each person's individual mission and future, and the names and emails address of every intelligent being in the universe. This is, in short, an intriguing library. But before going further with it, let's talk about COMSOL Multiphysics. First, when I first encountered COMSOL Multiphysics in 2004, I was at Polaroid and we were inventing a thermal print media, which has now become the zinc media. And we licensed COMSOL Multiphysics to do the problem of analyzing that medium and how to optimize it. This is a multiphysics problem involving both thermal and mechanical equations. And the reason is this. We have a thermal print head with a little glass bump on the bottom that carries hundreds of little heating elements. That sits on the media, and the media sits on this circular rubber platen down below. When you press the print head on the media, it compresses the media and the platen, and that causes the media to slightly distort and wrap around the heater, which is on a circular bump. So the amount of contact you get between the media and the heater depends on mechanical properties of all these devices. And then after you've got that, you also need to do the thermal problem. And the thermal problem is based on a very tricky thing that we invented for addressing full color, which is a three-dimensional color space. with a single variable, which is one-dimensional heat. So that was the great invention, and it was that we had to optimize. The media itself is made of a dozen layers, including 3 of which are dye layers. And to make it commercially viable, we have to coat many layers at a time. And they flow down a ramp and stack up, as shown, as indicated on the right. They're squeezed out of little coating head elements here, and they flow down a ramp, and then they pile up on top of each other. And then they're poured off the ramp as a waterfall and land on a very, very quickly moving web or substrate, which is moving here, and then they have to go off and be dried. Well, it turned out after we had the medium under control, we had to manufacture it, and we had to learn how to make a waterfall like this that could pour the media on the quickly moving web without mixing any of the layers together. So the first thing that we faced was that we had coating heads. We're not a rich company because we're just a startup, but we had coating heads, and they some of the layers in this structure have to be accurate to just a few percent. And the coating head was exceeding that tolerance. And the reason was that our fluids were very non-Newtonian. So we had to think of some way, without making new coating heads, we had to think of some way to get the system within a few percent. And what we did is use a COMSOL model. This shows half of the coating head. The coating is done about 5 feet wide, and it wants to be accurate to a fraction of a micron over that whole width. So what we decided was that this shows the coating fluid coming up through one of the elements of the coating head, flowing out the side arms, and then it gets squeegeed out into the flow pattern. And we decided that if we ran the fluid into the coating head at a slightly lower temperature than the coating head was sitting at, then the fluid would be cold in the middle of the coating head, and it would be warmer at the ends because it would be warming up as it went. And because of the temperature dependence of its viscosity, that would tailor the flow rate that was coming out of the slot of the coating head. And in fact, it was one of the first things I reported on at a COMSOL conference. Shown on the right here is that the non-uniformity that you get as a function of temperature was a nice straight line, and there was a magic temperature at 8 degrees at which perfectly compensated for the variable, the thickness of the coating. Then we went on to actually study the waterfall itself, which we call a curtain. And we wanted to understand very well that curtain, how it lands on the moving substrate, and then make sure that we could make it so that all the layers remained laminar and retained their integrity. And one thing that's in a curtain cover like this, the web that's coming along at high speed has entrained air on it, and it tends to creep under the fluid that you're trying to coat and leave bubbles underneath. So one of the things that we do is apply a voltage to the system, because the fluid that we're coating is conductive. And if you apply a voltage, that becomes one side of a capacitor, and the applied voltage is the other side of the capacitor, and there's a force there, and you try to make the force big enough to pull the curtain down and expel air from underneath. We also, after we had coated the media, we had to dry it, and there's an awful lot of water per unit time being thrown on the media or poured on the media. So we have to get rid of a lot of water. And in fact, we have a series of 28 plenums with the media going up and down past the plenums with hot air blowing on them. And we soon discovered that the air jets that were blowing on the media before it was fully dry were creating little patterns in the media, which then showed up in the pictures that were later printed. So we used COMSOL to design some airfoils that we could stick on the media. They cost about 50 cents a piece. I mean, we could stick them on the plenums, and it straightened out. It made the air pressure more uniform across the web so that we got rid of those features. Then after we had coated the media, we had to wind it up. And you would imagine that winding something on a roll would be a fairly simple thing, but it's a whole area of technology. And this is the kind of thing in this picture that you can get into. You wind under fairly high tension to make a nice tight roll. But what happens is, as you're winding, you're applying more and more pressure on the center of the roll, and you're squeezing it inwards, so that the tension that you put in the web when it was first wrapped is being reduced as the pressure is pushing it to a smaller radius. And then at some point, the whole thing just lets go and starts turning, and then comes to a stop and leaves these patterns in the roll, which again end up showing up in prints. One that's come up lately is a model that has come up lately is that we find that we now have a coating that we apply that when we then later unwrap the roll that we've applied the coating to, it generates a huge triboelectric charge. And this charge ends up affecting the coating operation because of that field affecting the way that the liquid falls on the web. So we've got here an AC/DC electrical model that calculates where all the electric fields are and how we can. This is, by the way, is a pretty dramatic thing to see. We are generating charge right here where the media separates from the roll, and it leaves positive charge on the media that's going away from the roll, and the corresponding negative charge goes on the outside of the roll, and then comes around and joins the positive charge later on. So the media that's going away from the roll is perfectly neutral. It's highly charged, but perfectly neutral. Positive on top, negative on the bottom, and balanced. It's very hard to get that charge off because there's no electric field. You measure with a field meter, you don't see anything. But if you come up behind this roll and put a little piece of conducting string behind it that's connected to ground, there's exposed negative charge on this roll. When you remove that, then suddenly the media leaving the roll becomes highly positive charged. And you hear these lightning bolts going off in the factory. And everybody's hair is standing on it because you've just constructed a Van de Graaff machine. So this is the problem we're trying to solve with modeling. After you've made your rolls and you've cut your media into sheets and so on, then you start making products with it. We don't make the hardware in general, but we do work with people to teach them how to print properly on this media. And one of the things is that the print head is thermal, and as you print, it's generating heat, so it gets hotter and hotter. And you want to get rid of that heat, but you don't want to use a fan because most of our products are battery operated. So we've gone through some designs of how do you make cases around objects that are getting hot and keep the surface temperatures on the case perfectly comfortable for the customer. Anyway, what's the point of this? I don't want to drag you through every manufacturing problem that we've ever faced, but the point was that we licensed COMSOL to do a particular job in thermal analysis, or thermomechanical analysis. But since about 2004, the product has never been idle. There are always problems coming from the factory, from the product designers, and from the inventors, problems requiring some kind of analysis in invention, design, manufacturing, or product improvement. And you might say to me, well, of course you use COMSOL, you have a hammer, so every problem starts looking like a nail to you. But I think it's more than that. I think the actual rule is if you have the right hammer, then every problem is a nail. And by that I mean that if you look at all the principal laws of science and engineering, they're almost all second-order differential equations. Maxwell's equations, Navier-Stokes, Newton's laws, chemical reaction, Nernst-Planck, diffusion equation, Schrödinger equation, and so on. These are all second-order differential equations, and when you're dealing with science that is not second-order differential equations, most often it's first-order differential equations, which is just a special case. And if it's not first-order differential equations, it's almost always just algebraic equations, which is an even more special case. And if it's higher-order differential equations, then you can generally write it as collections of second-order differential equations. And you may have collections of all of the above. So in a sense, if you agree with me that virtually all of science and engineering falls into this category, then you're agreeing to something very unusual, namely that for science and engineering, COMSOL Multiphysics is the Library of Babel. You can think of each of your models, each of your choices of geometry and mesh and coefficients and boundary conditions as corresponding to a book in the library. It's producing a solution that you can then go read. And the library contains every possible book, every problem that you're ever going to face, every invention that you've ever made or ever will make is already in COMSOL. That's the concept. And it includes such great problems as the past and future of the universe, cures for epidemic diseases, the fate of the oceans and atmosphere, the sources of energy and how to find, store, and use them. And best of all, this particular Library of Babel is not a fiction. It's real. Version 4.3a of the Library of Babel is sitting on your computer right now. And what are you doing? You're listening to me. You're looking at your watch saying, when's lunch? It's got some pretty fantastic stuff in it waiting to get out. And in this library, we are the monks. We're the ones going around looking in the books, pulling them off the shelves, seeing if there's any book in there with something really important in it, like, "O time, thy pyramids." Some of the solutions are difficult and give results that are difficult to understand. They may be sort of in a foreign language or written backwards or encoded in some way that we don't immediately understand. And millions of them have one error, where I'm speaking for myself now, but I strongly suspect that it's true for you as well, that millions of your simulations have one error or two errors in them that make them not quite right. But hidden among all this chaff are the greatest prizes of all times, and that's why we do what we do. So as you well know, there are lots of opportunities in this library for monks. But it helps if you're a monk. It helps if you're a very, very patient monk and can learn to train a cat to jump through hoops. And if you're wondering what "O time, thy pyramids" means, see next page. And the next page is a poem called "O time, thy pyramids," which I thought it sounded like a poetic phrase, so I just let the poem write itself. And you can read it at your leisure, but if you think this is a horrible poem, just remember that somewhere in the Library of Babel, back on the stacks is a dusty book, and when you open it up, this poem will be on the first page, and it has your name on it. So that's my little philosophical version. I hope you enjoyed it.